And here we go with Chapter 13, Alice Pyncheon. There was a message brought, one day, from the worshipful Gervase Pyncheon to young Matthew Maule, the carpenter, desiring his immediate presence at the house of the Seven Gables. "And what does your master want with me?" said the carpenter to Mr. Pyncheon's black servant. "Does the house need any repair? Well, it may, by this time, and no blame to my father who built it, neither. I was reading the old colonel's tombstone no longer than last Sabbath, and reckoning from that date the house has stood 37 years. No wonder if there should be a job to do on the roof." "Don't know what massa wants," answered Scipio. "The house is very good house, and old Colonel Pyncheon thinks so too, I reckon. Else why the old man haunt it so, and frighten a poor man like me as he does." "Well, well, friend Scipio, let your master know that I'm coming," said the carpenter with a laugh. "For a fair, workman-like job he'll find me his man. And so the house is haunted, is it? It will take a tighter workman than I am to keep the spirits out of the Seven Gables. Even if the colonel would be quiet," he added, muttering to himself, "my old grandfather, the wizard, will be pretty sure to stick to the Pyncheons as long as their walls hold together." "What's that you mutter to yourself, Matthew Maule?" asked Scipio. "And what for do you look so black at me?" "No matter, darky," said the carpenter. "Do you think nobody is to look black but yourself? Go tell your master I'm coming, and if you happen to see Mistress Alice, his daughter, give Matthew Maule's humble respects to her. She has brought a fair face from Italy, fair and gentle and proud, as the same Alice Pyncheon." "He talk of Mistress Alice," cried Scipio, as he returned from his errand. "The low carpenter man, he'd no business so much as to look at her a great way off." This young Matthew Maule, the carpenter, it must be observed, was a person little understood, and not very generally liked in the town where he resided. Not that anything could be alleged against his integrity, or his skill and diligence in the handicraft which he exercised. The aversion, as it might justly be called, with which many persons regarded him, was partly the result of his own character and deportment, and partly an inheritance. He was the grandson of a former Matthew Maule, one of the early settlers of the town, and who had been a famous and terrible wizard in his day. This old reprobate was one of the sufferers when Cotton Mather and his brother ministers, and the learned judges, and other wise men, and Sir William Phipps, the sagacious governor, made such laudable efforts to weaken the great enemy of souls, by sending a multitude of his adherents up the rocky pathway of Gallows Hill. Since those days, no doubt, it had grown to be suspected that, in consequence of an unfortunate overdoing of a work praiseworthy in itself, the proceedings against the witches had proved far less acceptable to the beneficent father than to that very arch-enemy whom they were intended to distress and utterly overwhelm. It is not the less certain, however, that awe and terror brooded over the memories of those who died for this horrible crime of witchcraft. Their graves, in the crevices of the rocks, were supposed to be incapable of retaining the occupants who had been so hastily thrust into them. Old Matthew Maule especially was known to have as little hesitation or difficulty in rising out of his grave as an ordinary man in getting out of bed, and was often seen at midnight as living people at noonday. This pestilent wizard, in whom his just punishment seemed to have wrought no manner of amendment, had an inveterate habit of haunting a certain mansion, styled the House of the Seven Gables, against the owner of which he pretended to hold an unsettled claim for ground rent. The ghost, it appears, with the pertinacity which was one of his distinguishing characteristics while alive, insisted that he was the rightful proprietor of the site upon which the house stood. His terms were that either the aforesaid ground rent, from the day when the cellar began to dig, should be paid down, or the mansion itself given up. Else he, the ghostly creditor, would have his finger in all the affairs of the Pinchians, and make everything go wrong with them, though it should be 1,000 years after his death. It was a wild story, perhaps, but seemed not altogether so incredible to those who could remember what an inflexibly obstinate old fellow this wizard Maule had been. Now, the wizard's grandson, the young Matthew Maule of our story, was popularly supposed to have inherited some of his ancestors' questionable traits. It is wonderful how many absurdities were promulgated in reference to the young man. He was fabled, for example, to have a strange power of getting into people's dreams and regulating matters there according to his own fancy, pretty much like the stage manager of a theatre. There was a great deal of talk among the neighbors, particularly the petticoated ones, about what they called the witchcraft of Maule's eye. Some said that he could look into people's minds, others that by the marvelous power of this eye he could draw people into his own mind, or send them, if he pleased, to do errands to his grandfather in the spiritual world. Others, again, that it was what is termed an evil eye, and possessed the valuable faculty of blighting corn and drying children into mummies with the heartburn. But, after all, what worked most to the young carpenter's disadvantage was, first, the reserve and sternness of his natural disposition, and next, the fact of his not being a church communicant, and the suspicion of his holding heretical tenets in matters of religion and polity. After receiving Mr. Pinchian's message, the carpenter merely tarried to finish a small job, which he happened to have in hand, and then took his way towards the house of the Seven Gables. This noted edifice, though its style might be getting a little out of fashion, was still as respectable a family residence as that of any gentleman in town. The present owner, Gervase Pinchian, was said to have contracted a dislike to the house, in consequence of a shock to his sensibility, in early childhood, from the sudden death of his grandfather. In the very act of running to climb Colonel Pinchian's knee, the boy had discovered the old Puritan to be a corpse. Oh, is this the same guy? Gervase Pinchian was said to... Okay, no, Gervase Pinchian, okay, he was the one who discovered the grandfather had the big bloody stroke thing. In the very act of running to climb Colonel Pinchian's knee, the boy had discovered the old Puritan to be a corpse. On arriving at manhood, Mr. Pinchian had visited England, where he married a lady of fortune, and had subsequently spent many years, partly in the mother country, and partly in various cities on the continent of Europe. During this period, the family mansion had been consigned to the charge of a kinsman, who was allowed to make it his home for the time being, in consideration of keeping the premises in thorough repair. So faithfully had this contract been fulfilled that now, as the carpenter approached the house, his practised eye could detect nothing to criticize in its condition. The peaks of the Seven Gables rose up sharply, the shingled roof looked thoroughly watertight, and the glittering plasterwork entirely covered the exterior walls and sparkled in the October sun as if it had been new only a week ago. The house had that pleasant aspect of life which is like the cheery expression of comfortable activity in the human countenance. You could see at once that there was the stir of a large family within it. A huge load of oak wood was passing through the gateway, towards the outbuildings in the rear. The fat cook, or probably it might be the housekeeper, stood at the side door, bargaining for some turkeys and poultry which a countryman had brought for sale. Now and then a maid-servant, neatly dressed, and now the shining sable face of a slave, might be seen bustling across the windows in the lower part of the house. At an open window of a room in the second story, hanging over some pots of beautiful and delicate flowers, exotics, but which had never known a more genial sunshine than that of the New England autumn, was the figure of a young lady, an exotic, like the flowers, and beautiful and delicate as they. Her presence imparted an indescribable grace and faint witchery to the whole edifice. In other respects, it was a substantial, jolly-looking mansion, and seemed fit to be the residence of a patriarch, who might establish his own headquarters in the front gable, and assign one of the remainder to each of his 6 children, while the great chimney in the centre should symbolize the old fellow's hospitable heart, which kept them all warm, and made a great whole of the 7 smaller ones. There was a vertical sundial on the front gable, and as the carpenter passed beneath it, he looked up and noted the hour. 3 o'clock, said he to himself. My father told me that dial was put up only an hour before the old colonel's death. How truly it has kept time these 37 years past. The shadow creeps and is always looking over the shoulder of the sunshine. It might have befitted a craftsman, like Matthew Maule, on being sent for to a gentleman's house, to go to the back door, where servants and workpeople were usually admitted, or at least to the side entrance, where the better class of tradesmen made application. But the carpenter had a great deal of pride and stiffness in his nature, and at this moment, moreover, his heart was bitter with the sense of hereditary wrong, because he considered the great Pincian house to be standing on soil which should have been his own. On this very site, beside a spring of delicious water, his grandfather had felled the pine trees and built a cottage in which children had been born to him, and it was only from a dead man's stiffened fingers that Colonel Pincian had wrested away the title deeds. So young Maule went straight to the principal entrance beneath a portal of carved oak, and gave such a peal of the iron knocker that you would have imagined the stern old wizard himself to be standing at the threshold. Black Scipio answered the summons in a prodigious hurry, but showed the whites of his eyes in amazement on beholding only the carpenter. "Lord a mercy, what a great man he be, this carpenter fellow," mumbled Scipio down in his throat. "Anybody think he beat on the door with his biggest hammer?" "Here I am," said Maule sternly. "Show me the way to your master's parlour." As he stepped into the house, a note of sweet and melancholy music thrilled and vibrated along the passageway, proceeding from one of the rooms above stairs. It was the harpsichord which Alice Pincian had brought with her from beyond the sea. The fair Alice bestowed most of her maiden leisure between flowers and music, although the former were apt to droop, and the melodies were often sad. She was of foreign education, and could not take kindly to the New England modes of life, in which nothing beautiful had ever been developed. As Mr. Pincian had been impatiently awaiting Maule's arrival, Black Scipio, of course, lost no time in ushering the carpenter into his master's presence. The room in which this gentleman sat was a parlour of moderate size, looking out upon the garden of the house, and having its windows partly shadowed by the foliage of fruit trees. It was Mr. Pincian's peculiar apartment, and was provided with furniture in an elegant and costly style, principally from Paris. The floor, which was unusual at that day, being covered with a carpet so skilfully and richly wrought that it seemed to glow as with living flowers. In one corner stood a marble woman, to whom her own beauty was the sole and sufficient garment. Some pictures that looked old and had a mellow tinge, diffused through all their artful splendor, hung on their walls. Near the fireplace was a large and very beautiful cabinet of ebony, inlaid with ivory, a piece of antique furniture, which Mr. Pinchian had bought in Venice, and which he used as the treasure-place for medals, ancient coins, and whatever small and valuable curiosities he had picked up on his travels. Through all this variety of decoration, however, the room showed its original characteristics, its low stud, its crossbeam, its chimney-piece, with the old-fashioned Dutch tiles, so that it was the emblem of a mind industriously stored with foreign ideas, and elaborated into artificial refinement, but neither larger, nor in its proper self more elegant than before. There were two objects that appeared rather out of place in this very handsomely furnished room. One was a large map, or surveyor's plan, of a tract of land, which looked as if it had been drawn a good many years ago, and was now dingy with smoke, and soiled, here and there, with the touch of fingers. The other was a portrait of a stern old man, in a Puritan garb, painted roughly, but with a bold effect, and with a remarkably strong expression of character. At a small table, before a fire of English sea-coal, sat Mr. Pinchian, sipping coffee, which had grown to be a very favorite beverage with him in France. He was a middle-aged and really handsome man, with a wig flowing down upon his shoulders. His coat was of blue velvet, with lace on the borders, and at the buttonholes, and the firelight glistened on the spacious breadth of his waistcoat, which was flowered all over with gold. On the entrance of Scipio, ushering in the carpenter, Mr. Pinchian turned partly round, but resumed his former position, and proceeded deliberately to finish his cup of coffee, without immediate notice of the guest whom he had summoned to his presence. It was not that he intended any rudeness or improper neglect, which indeed he would have blushed to be guilty of, but it never occurred to him that a person in Maule's station had a claim on his courtesy, or would trouble himself about it in one way or the other. The carpenter, however, stepped at once to the hearth, and turned himself about so as to look Mr. Pinchian in the face. "You sent for me," said he. "Be pleased to explain your business, that I may go back to my own affairs." "Excuse me," said Mr. Pinchian quietly. "I did not mean to tax your time without a recompense. Your name is Maule, I think? Thomas or Matthew Maule, a son or grandson of the builder of this house?" "Matthew Maule," replied the carpenter, "son of him who built the house, grandson of the rightful proprietor of the soil." "I know the dispute to which you allude," observed Mr. Pinchian with undisturbed equanimity. "I am well aware that my grandfather was compelled to resort to a suit at law in order to establish his claim to the foundation site of this edifice. We will not, if you please, renew the discussion. The matter was settled at the time, and by the competent authorities, equitably, it is to be presumed, and at all events, irrevocably. Yet, singularly enough, there is an incidental reference to this very subject in what I am now about to say to you, and this same inveterate grudge, excuse me, I mean no offense, this irritability which you have just shown is not entirely aside from the matter." "If you can find anything for your purpose, Mr. Pinchian," said the carpenter, "in a man's natural resentment for the wrongs done to his blood, you are welcome to it." "I take you at your word, good man Maule," said the owner of the Seven Gables, with a smile, "and will proceed to suggest a mode in which your hereditary resentments, justifiable or otherwise, may have had a bearing on my affairs. You have heard, I suppose, that the Pinchian family, ever since my grandfather's days, have been prosecuting a still unsettled claim to a very large extent of territory at the eastward." "Often," replied Maule, and it is said that a smile came over his face. "Very often, from my father." "This claim," continued Mr. Pincheon, after pausing a moment, as if to consider what the carpenter's smile might mean, appeared to be on the very verge of a settlement and full allowance at the period of my grandfather's decease. It was well known to those in his confidence that he neither anticipated difficulty nor delay. Now, Colonel Pincheon, I need hardly say, was a practical man, well acquainted with public and private business, and not at all the person to cherish ill-founded hopes, or to attempt the following out of an impracticable scheme. It is obvious to conclude, therefore, that he had the grounds, not apparent to his heirs, for his confident anticipation of success in the matter of this Eastern claim. In a word, I believe, and my legal advisers coincide in the belief, which, moreover, is authorized, to a certain extent, by the family traditions, that my grandfather was in possession of some deed or other document essential to this claim, but which has since disappeared. "Very likely," said Matthew Mole. And again, it is said, there was a dark smile on his face. "But what can a poor carpenter have to do with the grand affairs of the Pincheon family?" "Perhaps nothing," returned Mr. Pincheon. "Possibly much." Here ensued a great many words between Matthew Mole and the proprietor of the Seven Gables, on the subject which the latter had thus broached. It seems, although Mr. Pincheon had some hesitation in referring to stories so exceedingly absurd in their aspect, that the popular belief pointed to some mysterious connection and dependence existing between the family of the Moles and these vast unrealized possessions of the Pincheons. It was an ordinary saying that the old wizard, hanged though he was, had obtained the best end of the bargain in his contest with Colonel Pincheon, inasmuch as he had got possession of the great Eastern claim in exchange for an acre or two of garden ground. A very aged woman, recently dead, had often used the metaphorical expression, in her fireside talk, that miles and miles of the Pincheon lands had been shovelled into Mole's grave, which, by the by, was but a very shallow nook between two rocks, near the summit of Gallows Hill. Again, when the lawyers were making inquiry for the missing document, it was a byword that it would never be found, unless in the wizard's skeleton hand. So much weight had the shrewd lawyers assigned to these fables, that— but Mr. Pincheon did not see fit to inform the carpenter of the fact. They had secretly caused the wizard's grave to be searched. Nothing was discovered, however, except that, unaccountably, the right hand of the skeleton was gone. Now, what was unquestionably important, a portion of these popular rumors could be traced, though rather doubtfully and indistinctly, to chance words and obscure hints of the executed wizard's son, and the father of this present Matthew Mole. And here Mr. Pincheon could bring an item of his own personal evidence into play. Though but a child at the time, he either remembered or fancied that Matthew's father had had some job to perform on the day before, or possibly the very morning of the colonel's decease, in the private room where he and the carpenter were at this moment talking. Certain papers belonging to Colonel Pincheon, as his grandson distinctly recollected, had been spread out on the table. Matthew Mole understood the insinuated suspicion. "My father," he said, but still there was that dark smile making a riddle of his countenance. "My father," he said, "was an honester man than the bloody old colonel. Not to get his rights back again would he have carried off one of those papers." "I shall not bandy words with you," observed the foreign-bred Mr. Pincheon, with haughty composure. "Nor will it become to me to resent any rudeness towards either my grandfather or myself. A gentleman, before seeking intercourse with a person of your station and habits, will first consider whether the urgency of the end may compensate for the disagreeableness of the means. It does so in the present instance." He then renewed the conversation, and made great pecuniary offers to the carpenter, in case the latter should give information leading to the discovery of the lost document, and the consequent success of the Eastern claim. For a long time Matthew Mole is said to have turned a cold ear to these propositions. At last, however, with a strange kind of laugh, he inquired whether Mr. Pincheon would make over to him the old wizard's homestead ground, together with the house of the Seven Gables, now standing on it, in requital of the documentary evidence so urgently required. The wild chimney-corner legend, which, without copying all its extravagances, my narrative essentially follows, here gives an account of some very strange behavior on the part of Colonel Pincheon's portrait. This picture, it must be understood, was supposed to be so intimately connected with the fate of the house, and so magically built into its walls, that if once it should be removed, that very instant the whole edifice would come thundering down in a heap of dusty ruin. All through the foregoing conversation between Mr. Pincheon and the carpenter, the portrait had been frowning, clenching its fist, and giving many such proofs of excessive discomposure, but without attracting the notice of either of the two colloquists. And finally, at Matthew Mole's audacious suggestion of a transfer of the seven-gabled structure, the ghostly portrait is averred to have lost all patience, and to have shown itself on the point of descending bodily from its frame. But such incredible incidents are merely to be mentioned aside. "Give up this house," exclaimed Mr. Pincheon in amazement at the proposal. "Were I to do so, my grandfather would not rest quiet in his grave." "He never has, if all stories are true," remarked the carpenter composedly. "But that matter concerns his grandson more to it than it does Matthew Mole. I have no other terms to propose." Impossible, as he at first thought it, to comply with Mole's conditions, still, on a second glance, Mr. Pincheon was of opinion that they might at least be made matter of discussion. He himself had no personal attachment for the house, nor any pleasant associations connected with his childish residence in it. On the contrary, after 37 years, the presence of his dead grandfather— What? Good. The presence of his dead— What? Hang on. 1 second. My monitor just— Why is that? It made me all the way down. Good Lord. Okay. That was weird. Blah, 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 blah. Okay. Impossible as he first thought it to comply with Mole's conditions, still, on a second glance, Mr. Pincheon was of opinion that they might at least be made matters of discussion. He himself had no personal attachment for the house, nor any pleasant associations connected with his childish residence in it. On the contrary, after 37 years, the presence of his dead grandfather seemed still to pervade it, as on that morning when the affrighted boy had beheld him, with so ghastly an aspect, stiffening in his chair. His long abode in foreign parts, moreover, and familiarity with many of the castles and ancestral halls of England, and the marble palaces of Italy, had caused him to look contemptuously at the house of the Seven Gables, whether in point of splendor or convenience. It was a mansion exceedingly inadequate to the style of living which it would be incumbent on Mr. Pincheon to support, after realizing his territorial rights. His steward might deign to occupy it, but never, certainly, the great landed proprietor himself. In the event of success, indeed, it was his purpose to return to England, nor, to say the truth, would he recently have quitted that more congenial home, had not his own fortune, as well as his deceased wife's, begun to give symptoms of exhaustion. The Eastern claim, once fairly settled, and put upon the firm basis of actual possession, Mr. Pincheon's property, to be measured by miles, not acres, would be worth an earldom, and would reasonably entitle him to solicit, or enable him to purchase, that elevated dignity from the British monarch. Lord Pincian, or the Earl of Waldo. How could such a magnate be expected to contract his grandeur within the pitiful compass of 7 shingled gables? In short, on an enlarged view of the business, the carpenter's terms appeared so ridiculously easy that Mr. Pincian could scarcely forbear laughing in his face. He was quite ashamed, after the foregoing reflections, to propose any diminution of so moderate a recompense for the immense service to be rendered. "I consent to your proposition, Mall," cried he. "Put me in possession of the document essential to establish my rights, and the house of the Seven Gables is your own." According to some versions of the story, a regular contract to the above effect was drawn up by a lawyer, and signed and sealed in the presence of witnesses. Others say that Matthew Mall was contented with a private written agreement, in which Mr. Pincian pledged his honor and integrity to the fulfillment of the terms concluded upon. The gentleman then ordered wine, which he and the carpenter drank together in confirmation of their bargain. During the whole preceding discussion and subsequent formalities, the old Puritan's portrait seems to have persisted in its shadowy gestures of disapproval, but without effect, except that, as Mr. Pincian set down the emptied glass, he thought he beheld his grandfather frown. "This sherry is too potent a wine for me. It has affected my brain already," he observed, after a somewhat startled look at the picture. "On returning to Europe, I shall confine myself to the more delicate vintages of Italy and France, the best of which will not bear transportation." "My Lord Pincian may drink what wine he will, and wherever he pleases," replied the carpenter, as if he had been privy to Mr. Pincian's ambitious projects. "But first, sir, if you desire tidings of this lost document, I must crave the favor of a little talk with your fair daughter Alice." "You are mad, Mall," exclaimed Mr. Pincian haughtily. And now, at last, there was anger mixed up with his pride. "What can my daughter have to do with a business like this?" Indeed, at this new demand on the carpenter's part, the proprietor of the Seven Gables was even more thunderstruck than at the cool proposition to surrender his house. This demon killer! What? Yeah, boy, oh boy, people popping in the chat there. Doing good. Okay, you've had a couple of birthdays, all right. And you're a freshman, okay, into the old high school. It's been good. It's been a good day so far. Let me catch up with Chad in between chapters here, though. Yeah, we'll catch up with you, Demon Killer. Indeed, at this new demand on the carpenter's part, the proprietor of the Seven Gables was even more thunderstruck than at the cool proposition to surrender his house. There was at least an assignable motive for the first stipulation. There appeared to be none whatever for the last. Nevertheless, Matthew Mall sturdily insisted on the young lady being summoned, and even gave her father to understand, in a mysterious kind of explanation, which made the matter considerably darker than it looked before, that the only chance of acquiring the requisite knowledge was through the clear, crystal medium of a pure and virgin intelligence, like that of the fair Alice. Not to encumber our story with Mr. Pincian's scruples, whether of conscience, pride, or fatherly affection, he at length ordered his daughter to be called. He well knew that she was in her chamber, and engaged in no occupation that could not readily be laid aside, for, as it happened, ever since Alice's name had been spoken, both her father and the carpenter had heard the sad and sweet music of her harpsichord, and the area melancholy of her accompanying voice. So Alice Pincian was summoned, and appeared. A portrait of this young lady, painted by a Venetian artist and left by her father in England, is said to have fallen into the hands of the present Duke of Devonshire, and to be now preserved at Chatsworth, not on account of any associations with the original, but for the value as a picture, and the high character of beauty in the countenance. If ever there was a lady born, and set apart from the world's vulgar mass by a certain gentle and cold stateliness, it was this very Alice Pyncheon. Yet there was the womanly mixture in her, the tenderness, or at least the tender capabilities. For the sake of that redeeming quality, a man of generous nature would have forgiven all her pride, and have been content, almost, to lie down in her path, and let Alice set her slender foot upon his heart. All that he would have required was simply the acknowledgment that he was indeed a man and a fellow being, moulded of the same elements as she. As Alice came into the room, her eyes fell upon the carpenter, who was standing near its centre, clad in green woolen jacket, a pair of loose breeches, open at the knees, and with a long pocket for his rule, the end of which protruded. It was as proper a mark of the artisan's calling as Mr. Pyncheon's full-dress sword of that gentleman's aristocratic pretensions. A glow of artistic approval brightened over Alice Pyncheon's face. She was struck with admiration, which she made no attempt to conceal, of the remarkable comeliness, strength, and energy of Maule's figure. But that admiring glance, which most other men, perhaps, would have cherished as a sweet recollection all through life, the carpenter never forgave. It must have been the devil himself that made Maule so subtle in his perception. Actually, let me look that maybe it's not a archaic subtle. Subtile. No definition found. All right. I've just been assuming, which you shouldn't do. But that was an archaic spelling of subtle. Okay, but it's not in the Kindle dictionary, even for archaic, right? Does the girl look at me as if I were a brute beast? Thought he, setting his teeth. She shall know whether I have a human spirit, and the worse for her if it proves stronger than her own. My father, you sent for me, said Alice in her sweet and harp-like voice. But if you have business with this young man, pray let me go again. You know I do not love this room, in spite of that Claude with which you try to bring back sunny recollections. Stay a moment, young lady, if you please, said Matthew Mole. My business with your father is over. With yourself it is now to begin. Alice looked towards her father in surprise and inquiry. Yes, Alice, said Mr. Pyncheon, with some disturbance and confusion. This young man, his name is Matthew Mole, professes, so far as I can understand him, to be able to discover, through your means, a certain... Oh boy, okay, that was a disconnect and a reconnect. Man, okay. Hope it is, hope it's still going. All right. Let me know if there's any issues with it, but I think we're back again. Yes, Alice, said Mr. Pyncheon, with some disturbance and confusion. This young man, his name is Matthew Mole, professes, so far as I can understand him, to be able to discover, through your means, a certain paper or parchment which was missing long before your birth. The importance of the document in question renders it advisable to neglect no possible, even if improbable, method of regaining it. You will therefore oblige me, my dear Alice, by answering this person's inquiries, and complying with his lawful and reasonable requests, so far as they may appear to have the aforesaid object in view. As I shall remain in the room, you need apprehend no rude nor unbecoming deportment on the young man's part, and at your slightest wish, of course, the investigation, or whatever we may call it, shall immediately be broken off. Mistress Alice Pyncheon, remarked Matthew Mole with the utmost deference, but yet with a half-hidden sarcasm in his look and tone, "will no doubt feel herself quite safe in her father's presence, and under his all-sufficient protection."
"I certainly shall entertain no manner of apprehension with my father at hand," said Alice with maidenly dignity. "Neither do I conceive that a lady, while true to herself, can have aught to fear from whomsoever, or in any circumstances."
Poor Alice! By what unhappy impulse did she thus put herself at once on terms of defiance against a strength which she could not estimate? "Then, Mistress Alice," said Matthew Mole, handing a chair, gracefully enough for a craftsman, "will it please you only to sit down and do me the favour, though altogether beyond a poor carpenter's deserts, to fix your eyes on mine?" Alice complied. She was very proud. Setting aside all advantages of rank, this fair girl deemed herself conscious of a power, combined of beauty, high, unsullied purity, and the preservative force of womanhood, that could make her sphere impenetrable, unless betrayed by treachery within. She instinctively knew, it may be, that some sinister or evil potency was now striving to pass her barriers, nor would she decline the contest. So Alice put woman's might against man's might, a match not often equal on the part of woman. Her father, meanwhile, had turned away, and seemed absorbed in the contemplation of a landscape by Claude, where a shadowy and sun-streaked vista penetrated so remotely into an ancient wood that it would have been no wonder if his fancy had lost itself in the picture's bewildering depths. But in truth, the picture was no more to him at that moment than the blank wall against which it hung. His mind was haunted with the many and strange tales which he had heard, attributing mysterious, if not supernatural, endowments to these Maules, as well the grandson here present as his two immediate ancestors. Mr. Pincheon's long residence abroad, and intercourse with men of wit and fashion, courtiers, worldlings, and free-thinkers, had done much towards obliterating the grim Puritan superstitions, which no man of New England birth at that early period could entirely escape. But on the other hand, had not a whole community believed Maule's grandfather to be a wizard? Had not the crime been proved? Had not the wizard died for it? Had he not bequeathed a legacy of hatred against the Pincheons to this only grandson, who, as it appeared, was now about to exercise a subtle influence over the daughter of his enemy's house? Might not this influence be the same that was called witchcraft? Turning half around, he caught a glimpse of Maule's figure in the looking-glass. At some paces from Alice, with his arms uplifted in the air, the carpenter made a gesture as if directing downward a slow, ponderous, and invisible weight upon the maiden.
"Stay, Maule," exclaimed Mr. Pincheon, stepping forward. "I forbid your proceeding further." "Pray, my dear father, do not interrupt the young man," said Alice, without changing her position. "His efforts, I assure you, will prove very harmless."
Again Mr. Pincheon turned his eyes towards the Claude. It was then his daughter's will, in opposition to his own, that the experiment should be fully tried. Henceforth, therefore, he did but consent, not urge it. And was it not for her sake, far more than for his own, that he desired its success? That lost parchment once restored, the beautiful Alice Pincheon, with the rich dowry which he could then bestow, might wed an English duke or a German reigning prince, instead of some New England clergyman or lawyer. At the thought, the ambitious father almost consented in his heart that if the devil's power were needed to the accomplishment of this great object, Maule might evoke him. Alice's own purity would be her safeguard. With his mind full of imaginary magnificence, Mr. Pincheon heard a half-uttered exclamation from his daughter. It was very faint and low, so indistinct that there seemed but half a will to shape out the words, and too undefined a purport to be intelligible. Yet it was a call for help. His conscience never doubted it, and little more than a whisper to his ear, it was a dismal shriek, and long re-echoed so in the region round his heart. But this time the father did not turn. After a further interval, Maule spoke. "Behold your daughter," said he. Mr. Pincheon came hastily forward. The carpenter was standing erect in front of Alice's chair, and pointing his finger towards the maiden with an expression of triumphant power, the limits of which could not be defined, as indeed its scope stretched vaguely towards the unseen and the infinite. Alice sat in an attitude of profound repose, with the long brown lashes drooping over her eyes. "There she is," said the carpenter. "Speak to her."
"Alice, my daughter!" exclaimed Mr. Pincheon. "My own Alice!"
She did not stir. "Louder," said Maule, smiling.
"Alice, awake!" cried her father. "It troubles me to see you thus. Awake!"
He spoke loudly, with terror in his voice, and close to that delicate ear which had always been so sensitive to every discord. But the sound evidently reached her not. It is indescribable what a sense of remote, dim, unattainable distance betwixt himself and Alice was impressed on the father by this impossibility of reaching her with his voice. "Best touch her," said Matthew Maule. "Shake the girl, and roughly too. My hands are hardened with too much use of axe, saw, and plane, else I might help you." Mr. Pincheon took her hand, and pressed it with the earnestness of startled emotion. He kissed her, with so great a heart-throb in the kiss that he thought she must needs feel it. Then, in a gust of anger at her insensibility, he shook her maiden form with a violence which, the next moment, it affrighted him to remember. He withdrew his encircling arms, and Alice, whose figure, though flexible, had been wholly impassive, relapsed into the same attitude as before these attempts to arouse her. Maule having shifted his position, her face was turned towards him slightly, but with what seemed to be a reverence of her very slumber to his guidance. Then it was a strange sight to behold how the man of conventionalities shook the powder out of his periwig, how the reserved and stately gentleman forgot his dignity, how the gold-embroidered waistcoat flickered and glistened in the firelight with the convulsion of rage, terror, and sorrow in the human heart that was beating under it.
"Villain!"
cried Mr. Pincheon, shaking his clenched fist at Maule.
"You and the fiend together have robbed me of my daughter. Give her back, spawn of the old wizard, or you shall climb Gallows Hill in your grandfather's footsteps."
"Softly, Mr. Pincheon," said the carpenter, with scornful composure. "Softly, an't please your worship, else you will spoil those rich lace ruffles at your wrists. Is it my crime, if you have sold your daughter for the mere hope of getting a sheet of yellow parchment into your clutch? There sits Mistress Alice quietly asleep. Now let Matthew Maule try whether she be as proud as the carpenter found her a while since." He spoke, and Alice responded with a soft, subdued, inward acquiescence, and a bending of her form towards him, like the flame of a torch when it indicates a gentle draught of air. He beckoned with his hand, and rising from her chair, blindly but undoubtingly, as tending to her sure and inevitable centre, the proud Alice approached him. He waved her back, and retreating, Alice sank again into her seat. "She is mine," said Matthew Maule, "mine by the right of the strongest spirit." In the further progress of the legend, there is a long, grotesque, and occasionally awe-striking account of the carpenter's incantations, if so they are to be called, with a view of discovering the lost document. It appears to have been his object to convert the mind of Alice into a kind of telescopic medium, through which Mr. Pinchian and himself might obtain a glimpse into the spiritual world. He succeeded, accordingly, in holding an imperfect sort of intercourse, at one remove, with the departed personages in whose custody the so much valued secret had been carried beyond the precincts of earth. During her trance, Alice described 3 figures as being present to her spiritualized perception. One was an aged, dignified, stern-looking gentleman, clad as for a solemn festival in grave and costly attire, but with a great blood-stain on his richly wrought band. The second, an aged man, meanly dressed, with a dark and malign countenance, and a broken halter about his neck. And a third, a person not so advanced in life as the former 2, but beyond the middle age, wearing a coarse wooden tunic and leather breeches, with the carpenter's rule sticking out of his side pocket. These 3 visionary characters possessed a mutual knowledge of the missing document. One of them, in truth, it was he with the blood-stain on his band, seemed, unless his gestures were misunderstood, to hold the parchment in his immediate keeping, but was prevented by his 2 partners in the mystery from disburdening himself of the trust. Finally, when he showed a purpose of shouting forth the secret loudly enough to be heard from his own sphere into that of mortals, his companions struggled with him and pressed their hands over his mouth, and forthwith, whether that he were choked by it, or that the secret itself was of a crimson hue, there was a fresh flow of blood upon his band. Upon this, the 2 meanly dressed figures mocked and jeered at the much abased old dignitary, and pointed their fingers at the stain. At this juncture, Maule turned to Mr. Pinchian. "It will never be allowed," said he. "The custody of this secret that would so enrich his heirs makes part of your grandfather's retribution. He must choke with it until it is no longer of any value. And keep you the house of the 7 Gables. It is too dear bought an inheritance, and too heavy with a curse upon it, to be shifted yet a while from the colonel's posterity." Mr. Pinchian tried to speak, but, what with fear and passion, could only make a gurgling murmur in his throat. The carpenter smiled. "Ah, worshipful sir, so you have old Maule's blood to drink," said he jeeringly. "Fiend in man's shape, why dost thou keep dominion over my child?" cried Mr. Pinchian, when his choked utterance could make way. "Give me back my daughter, then go thy ways, and may we never meet again." "Your daughter," said Matthew Maule, "why, she is fairly mine. Nevertheless, not to be too hard with fair Mistress Alice, I will leave her in your keeping, but I do not warrant you that she shall never have occasion to remember Maule, the carpenter." He waved his hands with an upward motion, and after a few repetitions of similar gestures, the beautiful Alice Pinchian awoke from her strange trance. She awoke without the slightest recollection of her visionary experience, but as one losing herself in a momentary reverie and returning to the consciousness of actual life, in almost as brief an interval as the down-sinking flame of the hearth should quiver again up the chimney. Good Lord. On recognizing Matthew Maule, she assumed an air of somewhat cold but gentle dignity, the rather, as there was a certain peculiar smile on the carpenter's visage that stirred the native pride of the fair Alice. So ended, for that time, the quest for the lost title-deed of the Pinchian territory at the eastward, nor, though often subsequently renewed, has it ever yet befallen a Pinchian to set his eye upon that parchment. But alas for the beautiful, the gentle, yet too haughty Alice! A power that she little dreamed of had laid its grasp upon her maiden soul. A will, most unlike her own, constrained her to do its grotesque and fantastic bidding. Her father, as it proved, had martyred his poor child to an inordinate desire for measuring his land by miles instead of acres. And therefore, while Alice Pinchian lived, she was Maul's slave, in a bondage more humiliating 1,000-fold than that which binds its chain around the body. Seated by his humble fireside, Maul had but to wave his hand, and wherever the proud lady chanced to be, whether in her chamber, or entertaining her father's stately guests, or worshipping at church, whatever her place or occupation, her spirit passed from beneath her own control, and bowed itself to Maul. "Alice, laugh," the carpenter beside his hearth would say, or perhaps intensely will it, without a spoken word. And even if it were prayer time, or at a funeral, Alice must break into wild laughter. Alice be sad, and at the instant down would come her tears, quenching all the mirth of those around her like sudden rain upon a bonfire. Alice, dance, and dance she would, not in such court-like measures as she had learned abroad, but some high-paced jig, or hop-skip rigadoon, befitting the brisk lasses at a rustic merry-making. It seemed to be Maul's impulse not to ruin Alice, nor to visit her with any black or gigantic mischief, which could have crowned her sorrows with the grace of tragedy, but to wreak a low, ungenerous scorn upon her. Thus all the dignity of life was lost. She felt herself too much abased, and longed to change natures with some worm. One evening, at a bridal party, but not her own, for so lost from self-control she would have deemed it sin to marry, poor Alice was beckoned forth by her unseen despot, and constrained, in her gossamer white dress and satin slippers, to hasten along the street to the mean dwelling of a laboring man. There was laughter and good cheer within, for Matthew Maule that night was to wed the laborer's daughter, and had summoned proud Alice Pinchian to wait upon his bride. And so she did, and when the twain were one, Alice awoke out of her enchanted sleep, yet no longer proud. Humbly, and with a smile all steeped in sadness, she kissed Maul's wife, and went her way. It was an inclement night. The southeast wind drove the mingled snow and rain into her thinly sheltered bosom. Her satin slippers were wet through and through as she trod the muddy sidewalks. The next day, a cold. Soon, a settled cough. Anon, a hectic cheek, a wasted form that sat beside the harpsichord and filled the house with music. Music in which a strain of the heavenly choristers was echoed. Oh, joy! For Alice had borne her last humiliation. Oh, greater joy! For Alice was penitent of her one earthly sin, and proud no more. The Pinchians made a great funeral for Alice. The kith and kin were there, and the whole respectability of the town besides. But last in the procession came Matthew Maule, gnashing his teeth as if he would have bitten his own heart in twain, the darkest and woefulest man that ever walked behind a corpse. He meant to humble Alice, not to kill her, but he had taken a woman's delicate soul into his rude grip to play with, and she was dead. Yeah, okay, so I was not expecting that. Okay, all right, so now... Okay. All right, so this whole time... Okay, so that is a very, very supernatural event going on. So anyway, this whole time I have been quite convinced that all of the... all of the, the ghosts of the past and... Yeah, I've been quite sure that all of those were supposed to have been allegories of guilt, about what passed with old Matthew Mall, or the supposed wizard there, and everything being just playing out in everyone's minds. But that's not quite what was saying here, man. Okay, maybe there is some legit supernatural action going on, and I don't know. Don't know. Anyway, so Mr. Demon Killer's joined us. What's up, Demon Killer? We've been enjoying some education, some school. That's good. That's good. Alrighty. Okay, well, we're going to pop back to into our story in just a minute. I'm going to have a little bit of water. That was a long chapter. That took an hour to get through. Good Lord. That was a long time. A long time. Oh, there we go. Much better. Don't know that painting on the wall, though. They're talking about that an awful lot, that painting on the wall. Big motif. Big motif. All right. Let's see. Where's my... How do I see... Oh, no. I'm just clicking on a few buttons over here real fast. We're going to get back into it real soon. Ba-da-ba-ba. Where is... What is Super Chat? I don't know what Super Chat is on here on YouTube. Anya's going to have to go back and read this chapter. Oh yeah, it's yeah, it was kind of weird. It was mainly, I'd say 2/3 of it it does not include Alice Pinchian. The chapter's called Alice Pinchian. Yeah, the first 2/3 doesn't include her, but when it does, boy, do things escalate quickly or what? Man, you're gonna put a video of the house in Discord. Ah, nice. You're visited. Okay, so if I mean, I don't know a lot about the backstory of this book, but I think I read that the house was already built when Nathaniel Hawthorne saw it, right? And it kind of inspired him to write this story. I don't know, maybe it just looked like a big old haunted house to him. I don't know. Don't know. Man. Yeah, what oh, is this a... Oh, okay. Yes. Oh, that's right, man. Okay. This is the bit about having like a big break of like a few days before getting back into the book. I'd totally forgotten that was being narrated by Holgrave. That was being narrated by Holgrave. Oh, he lived next door to it. Okay. Yeah, there's a lot. Actually, in some ways, it actually kind of reminds me of there's a King Diamond album called Them, and it's not really the same, but it's kind of like it's like a haunted house kind of themed album. It's really good, but I don't know. I'm gonna have to fire that up sometime this week. Get a little King Diamond action going on. All right, okay. One more thing of water, and then we're gonna get into another chapter. Here we go. Man. Okay. Chapter 14. A Phoebe's Goodbye. Holgrave, plunging into his tale with the energy and absorption natural to a young author, had given a good deal of action to the parts capable of being developed and exemplified in that manner.
He now observed that a certain remarkable drowsiness, wholly unlike that with which the reader possibly feels himself affected, had been flung over the senses of his auditress. It was the effect, unquestionably, of the mystic gesticulations by which he had sought to bring bodily before Phoebe's perception the figure of the mesmerizing carpenter. With the lids drooping over her eyes, now lifted for an instant and drawn down again as with leaden weights, she leaned slightly towards him, and seemed almost to regulate her breath by his. Holgrave gazed at her as he rolled up his manuscript, and recognized an incipient stage of that curious psychological condition which, as he had himself told Phoebe, he possessed more than an ordinary faculty of producing. A veil was beginning to be muffled about her, in which she could behold only him, and live only in his thoughts and emotions. His glance, as he fastened it on the young girl, grew involuntarily more concentrated. In his attitude there was the consciousness of power, investing his hardly mature figure with a dignity that did not belong to its physical manifestation. It was evident that with but one wave of his hand and a corresponding effort of his will, he could complete his mastery over Phoebe's yet free and virgin spirit. He could establish an influence over this good, pure, and simple child, as dangerous and perhaps as disastrous as that which the carpenter of his legend had acquired and exercised over the ill-fated Alice. Oh, BW is all about Abigail. Yeah, that's a really good album too. Yeah, he did a sequel to that one. Yeah, just Abigail 2, which is terrible. And he did a sequel to another one of his ones as well. I think he did a sequel to them as well, actually. But yeah, he's got his albums are, for the most part, they're really good. I mean, they're very they're very consistent in their whole concept. Just like one big album telling like a big spooky supernatural story. But yeah, he's written some amazing ones. Yeah, Abigail, don't you think you know what we've done? To a disposition like Holgrave's, at once speculative and active, there is no temptation so great as the opportunity of acquiring empire over the human spirit, nor any idea more seductive to a young man than to become the arbiter of a young girl's destiny. Let us, therefore, whatever his defects of nature and education, and in spite of his scorn for creeds and institutions, concede to the daguerreotypist the rare and high quality of reverence for another's individuality. Let us allow him integrity also, forever after to be confided in, since he forbade himself to twine that one link more which might have rendered his spell over Phoebe indissoluble. Good Lord. Since he forbade himself to twine that one link more, which might have rendered his spell over Phoebe indissoluble. He made a slight gesture upward with his hand. "You really mortify me, my dear Miss Phoebe," he exclaimed, smiling half sarcastically at her. "My poor story, it is but too evident, will never do for Godey or Graham. Only think of your falling asleep at what I hoped the newspaper critics would pronounce a most brilliant, powerful, imaginative, pathetic, and original winding up. Well, the manuscript must serve to light lamps with. If indeed, being so imbued with my gentle dullness, it is any longer capable of flame." "Me? Asleep? How can you say so?" answered Phoebe, as unconscious of the crisis through which she had passed as an infant of the precipice to the verge of which it has rolled. No, no, I consider myself as having been very attentive, and though I don't remember the incidents quite distinctly, yet I have an impression of a vast deal of trouble and calamity, so, no doubt, the story will prove exceedingly attractive."
By this time, so Holgrave he's kind of got hypnotic powers as well. By this time the sun had gone down, and was tinting the clouds towards the zenith with those bright hues which are not seen there until some time after sunset, and when the horizon has quite lost its richer brilliancy. The moon, too, which had long been climbing overhead, and unobtrusively melting its disk into the azure, like an ambitious demagogue who hides his aspiring purpose by assuming the prevalent hue of popular sentiment, now began to shine out, broad and oval, in its middle pathway. These silvery beams were already powerful enough to change the character of the lingering daylight. They softened and embellished the aspect of the old house, although the shadows fell deeper into the angles of its many gables, and lay brooding under the projecting story, and within the half-open door. With the lapse of every moment, the garden grew more picturesque. The fruit trees, shrubbery, and flower bushes had a dark obscurity among them. The commonplace characteristics, which at noontide it seemed to have taken a century of sordid life to accumulate, were now transfigured by a charm of romance. 100 mysterious years were whispering among the leaves whenever the slight sea breeze found its way thither and stirred them. Through the foliage that roofed the little summer house, the moonlight flickered to and fro, and fell silvery white on the dark floor, the table and the circular bench, with a continual shift and play, according as the chinks and wayward crevices among the twigs admitted or shut out the glimmer. So sweetly cool was the atmosphere, after all the feverish day, that the summer eve might be fancied as sprinkling dews and liquid moonlight, with a dash of icy temper in them, out of a silver vase. Here and there a few drops of this freshness were scattered on a human heart, and gave it youth again, and sympathy with the eternal youth of nature. The artist chanced to be one on whom the reviving influence fell. It made him feel what he sometimes almost forgot, thrust so early as he had been into the rude struggle of man with man. How youthful he still was. "It seems to me," he observed, "that I never watched the coming of so beautiful an eve, and never felt anything so very much like happiness as at this moment. After all, what a good world we live in! How good and beautiful! How young it is, too, with nothing really rotten or age-worn in it. This old house, for example, which sometimes has positively oppressed my breath with its smell of decaying timber, and this garden, where the black mould always clings to my spade, as if I were a sexton delving in a graveyard. Could I keep the feeling that now possesses me, the garden would every day be virgin soil, with the earth's first freshness and the flavor of its beans and squashes. And the house, it would be like a bower in Eden, blossoming with the earliest roses that God ever made. Moonlight, and the sentiment in man's heart responsive to it, are the greatest of renovators and reformers, and all other reform and renovation, I suppose, will prove to be no better than moonshine."
"I have been happier than I am now, at least much gayer," said Phoebe thoughtfully. "Yet I am sensible of a great charm in this brightening moonlight, and I love to watch how the day, tired as it is, lags away reluctantly, and hates to be called yesterday so soon. I never cared much about moonlight before. What is there, I wonder, so beautiful in it tonight?"
"And you have never felt it before?" inquired the artist, looking earnestly at the girl through the twilight.
"Never," answered Phoebe, "and life does not look the same, now that I have felt it so. It seems as if I had looked at everything hitherto in broad daylight, or else in the ruddy light of a cheerful fire glimmering and dancing through a room. Oh, poor me," she added, with a half-melancholy laugh. "I shall never be as merry as before I knew Cousin Hepzibah and poor Cousin Clifford. I have grown a great deal older in this little time, older, and I hope wiser, and not exactly sadder, but certainly with not half so much lightness in my spirits. I have given them my sunshine, and have been glad to give it, but of course I cannot both give and keep it. They are welcome, notwithstanding."
"You have lost nothing, Phoebe, worth keeping, nor which it is possible to keep," said Holgrave after a pause. "Our first youth is of no value. We are never conscious of it until after it is gone. But sometimes, always I suspect, unless one is exceedingly unfortunate, there comes a sense of second youth, gushing out of the heart's joy at being in love, or possibly it may come to crown some other grand festival in life, if any other such there be. This bemoaning of one's self, as you do now, over the first careless, shallow gaiety of youth departed, and this profound happiness at youth regained, so much deeper and richer than that we lost, are essential to the soul's development. In some cases the two states come almost simultaneously, and mingle the sadness and the rapture in one mysterious emotion.
"I hardly think I understand you," said Phoebe.
"No wonder," replied Holgrave, smiling, "for I have told you a secret which I hardly began to know before I found myself giving it utterance. Remember it, however, and when the truth becomes clear to you, then think of this moonlight scene."
"It is entirely moonlight now, except only a little flush of faint crimson upward from the west between those buildings," remarked Phoebe. "I must go in. Cousin Hepzibah is not quick at figures, and will give herself a headache over the day's accounts, unless I help her."
But Holgrave detained her a little longer. "Miss Hepzibah tells me," observed he, "that you return to the country in a few days."
"Yes, but only for a little while," answered Phoebe, "for I look upon this as my present home. I go to make a few arrangements, and to take a more deliberate leave of my mother and friends. It is pleasant to live where one is much desired and very useful, and I think I may have the satisfaction of feeling myself so here."
"You surely may, and more than you imagine," said the artist. "Whatever health, comfort, and natural life exists in the house is embodied in your person. These blessings came along with you, and will vanish when you leave the threshold. Miss Hepzibah, by secluding herself from society, has lost all true Miss Hepzibah, by secluding herself from society, has lost all true relation with it, and is, in fact, dead. Although she galvanizes herself into a semblance of life, and stands behind her counter, afflicting the world with a greatly to be deprecated scowl. Your poor cousin Clifford is another dead and long-buried person, on whom the governor and council have wrought a necromantic miracle. I should not wonder if he were to crumble away some morning after you are gone, and nothing be seen of him more, except a heap of dust. Miss Hepzibah, at any rate, will lose what little flexibility she has. They both exist by you."
"I should be very sorry to think so," answered Phoebe gravely. "But it is true that my small abilities were precisely what they needed, and I have a real interest in their welfare, an odd kind of motherly sentiment, which I wish you would not laugh at. And let me tell you frankly, Mr. Holgrave, I am sometimes puzzled to know whether you wish them well or ill."
"Undoubtedly," said the daguerreotypist, "I do feel an interest in this antiquated, poverty-stricken old maiden lady, and this degraded and shattered gentleman, this abortive lover of the beautiful. A kindly interest, too, helpless old children that they are. But you have no conception what a different kind of heart mine is from your own. It is not my impulse, as regards these two individuals, either to help or hinder, but to look on, to analyze, to explain matters to myself, and to comprehend the drama which for almost 200 years has been dragging its slow length over the ground where you and I now tread. If permitted to witness the close, I doubt not to derive a moral satisfaction from it, go matters how they may. There is a conviction within me that the end draws nigh. But though Providence sent you hither to help, and sends me only as a privileged and meet spectator, I pledge myself to lend these unfortunate beings whatever aid I can."
"I wish you'd speak more plainly," cried Phoebe, perplexed and displeased. "And above all, that you would feel more like a Christian and a human being. How is it possible to see people in distress without desiring, more than anything else, to help and comfort them? You talk as if this old house was a theatre, and you seem to look at Miss Hepzibah's and Clifford's misfortunes, and those of generations before them, as a tragedy, such as I have seen acted in the hall of a country hotel, only the present one appears to be played exclusively for your amusement. I do not like this. The play costs the performers too much, and the audience is too cold-hearted."
"You are severe," said Holgrave, compelled to recognize a degree of truth in the piquant sketch of his own mood.
"And then," continued Phoebe, "what can you mean by your conviction, which you tell me of, that the end is drawing near? Do you know of any new trouble hanging over my poor relatives? If so, tell me at once, and I will not leave them."
"Forgive me, Phoebe," said the daguerreotypist, holding out his hand, to which the girl was constrained to yield her own. "I am somewhat of a mystic, it must be confessed. The tendency is in my blood, together with the faculty of mesmerism, which might have brought me to Gallows Hill in the good old times of witchcraft. Believe me, if I am really aware of any secret, the disclosure of which would benefit your friends, who are my own friends likewise, you should learn it before we depart. But I have no such knowledge."
"You hold something back," said Phoebe.
"Nothing. No secrets but my own," answered Holgrave. "I can perceive, indeed, that Judge Pincheon still keeps his eye on Clifford, in whose ruin he had so large a share. His motives and intentions, however, are a mystery to me. He is a determined and relentless man, with the genuine character of an inquisitor, and had he any object to gain by putting Clifford to the rack, I verily believe that he would wrench his joints from their sockets in order to accomplish it. But so wealthy and eminent as he is, so powerful in his own strength, and in the support of society on all sides, what can Judge Pincheon have to hope or fear from the imbecile, branded, half-torpid Clifford?"
"Yet," urged Phoebe, "you did speak as if misfortune were impending."
"Oh, that's because I am morbid," replied the artist. "My mind has a twist aside, like almost everyone's mind, except your own. Moreover, it is so strange to find myself an inmate of this old Pincheon house, and sitting in this old garden, hark how all's well is murmuring, that, were it only for this one circumstance, I cannot help fancying that destiny is arranging its fifth act for a catastrophe."
"There!" cried Phoebe with renewed vexation, for she was by nature as hostile to mystery as the sunshine to a dark corner. "You puzzle me more than ever."
Then let us part friends," said Holgrave, pressing her hand. "Or if not friends, let us part before you entirely hate me, you who love everybody else in the world."
"Good-bye, then," said Phoebe frankly. "I do not mean to be angry a great while, and should be sorry to have you think so. There has cousin Hepzibah been standing in the shadow of the doorway this quarter of an hour past. She thinks I stay too long in the damp garden. So good night, and good-bye."
On the second morning thereafter, Phoebe might have been seen, in her straw bonnet, with a shawl on one arm, and a little carpet-bag on the other, bidding adieu to Hepzibah and cousin Clifford. She was to take a seat in the next train of cars, which would transport her to within 6 miles of her country village. The tears were in Phoebe's eyes, A smile, dewy with affectionate regret, was glimmering around her pleasant mouth. She wondered how it came to pass that her life of a few weeks, here in this heavy-hearted old mansion, had taken such hold of her, and so melted into her associations as now to seem a more important centre-point of remembrance than all which had gone before. How had Hepzibah, grim, silent, and irresponsive to her overflow of cordial sentiment, contrived to win so much love? And Clifford, in his abortive decay, with the mystery of fearful crime upon him, and the close prison atmosphere yet lurking in his breath, how had he transformed himself into the simplest child whom Phoebe felt bound to watch over, and be, as it were, the providence of his unconsidered hours? Everything, at that instant of farewell, stood out prominently to her view. Look where she would, lay her hand on what she might, the object responded to her consciousness as if a moist human heart were in it. She peeped from the window into the garden, and felt herself more regretful at leaving the spot of black earth, vitiated with such an age-long growth of weeds, more joyful at the idea of again scenting her pine forests and fresh clover fields. She called Chanticleer, his 2 wives, and the venerable chicken, and threw them some crumbs of bread from the breakfast table. These being hastily gobbled up, the chicken spread its wings, and alighted close by Phoebe on the window-sill, where it looked gravely into her face, and vented its emotions in a croak. Phoebe bade it to be a good old chicken during her absence, and promised to bring it a little bag of buckwheat.
"Ah, Phoebe," remarked Hepzibah, "you do not smile so naturally as when you came to us. Then the smile chose to shine out. Now you choose it should. It is well that you are going back for a little while into your native air. There has been too much weight on your spirits. The house is too gloomy and lonesome, the shop is full of vexations, and as for me, I have no faculty of making things look brighter than they are. Dear Clifford has been your only comfort."
"Come hither, Phoebe," suddenly cried her cousin Clifford, who had said very little all the morning. "Close, close, and look me in the face." Phoebe put one of her small hands on each elbow of his chair, and leaned her face towards him, so that he might peruse it as carefully as he would. It is probable that the latent emotions of this parting hour had revived in some degree his bedimmed and enfeebled faculties. At any rate, Phoebe soon felt that, if not the profound insight of a seer, yet a more than feminine delicacy of appreciation was making her heart the subject of its regard. A moment before she had known nothing which she would have sought to hide. Now, as if some secret were hinted to her own consciousness through the medium of another's perception, she was fain to let her eyelids droop beneath Clifford's gaze. A blush, too, the redder because she strove hard to keep it down, ascended bigger and higher in a tide of fitful progress, until even her brow was all suffused within it. "It is enough, Phoebe," said Clifford with a melancholy smile. "When I first saw you, you were the prettiest little maiden in the world, and now you have deepened into beauty. Girlhood has passed into womanhood. The bud is abloom. Go now. I feel lonelier than I did." Phoebe took leave of the desolate couple, and passed through the shop, twinkling her eyelids to shake off a dewdrop, for, considering how brief her absence was to be, and therefore the folly of being cast down about it, she would not so far acknowledge her tears as to dry them with her handkerchief. On the doorstep she met the little urchin, whose marvelous feats of gastronomy have been recorded in the earlier pages of our narrative. She took from the window some specimen or other of natural history, her eyes being too dim with moisture to inform her accurately whether it was a rabbit or a hippopotamus. put it into the child's hand as a parting gift, and went her way. Old Uncle Venner was just coming out of his door with a wood horse and sore on his shoulder, and trudging along the street, he scrupled not to keep company with Phoebe, so far as their paths lay together. Nor, in spite of his patched coat and rusty beaver, and the curious fashion of his tow-cloth trousers, could she find it in her heart to outwalk him. "We shall miss you next Sabbath afternoon," observed the street philosopher. "It is unaccountable how little while it takes some folks to grow just as natural to a man as his own breath. And begging your pardon, Miss Phoebe, though there can be no offense if an old man's saying it, that's just what you have grown to me. My years have been a great many, and your life is but beginning, and yet you are somehow as familiar to me as if I'd found you at my mother's door, and you had blossomed like a running vine all along my pathway since. Come back soon, or I shall be gone to my farm, for I begin to find these wood-sawing jobs a little too tough for my backache."
"Very soon, Uncle Venner," replied Phoebe.
"And let it be the sooner, Phoebe, for the sake of those poor souls yonder," continued her companion. "They can never do without you, now. Never, Phoebe, never. No more than if one of God's angels had been living with them and making their dismal house pleasant and comfortable. Don't it seem to you that being a sad case, if some pleasant summer morning like this the angel should spread his wings and fly to the place where he came from? Well, just so they feel, now that you're going home by the railroad. They can't bear it, Miss Phoebe. So be sure to come back."
"I am no angel, Uncle Venner," said Phoebe, smiling as she offered him her hand at the street corner. "But I suppose people never feel so much like angels as when they are doing what little good they may. So I certainly shall come back."
Thus parted the old man and the rosy girl, and Phoebe took the wings of the morning and was soon flitting almost as rapidly away as if endowed with the aerial locomotion of the angels, to whom Uncle Venner had so graciously compared her. All right. Yes, just thinking a little bit about that Holgrave there. He, too, has the power of mesmerism. Now, does that mean anything? I don't know. It's got me thinking, though. It's got me thinking. Now, do we have time for one more chapter, or should we break out a short story to wind up to the top of the hour? Let me do a quick page count. Let's do a quick page count of the upcoming chapter here. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 30, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 40, 1, 2, that'll be too long. That will be too long. 40-odd pages. Still, we're doing good. We're doing good. We can find another little short story to read. Let's see. Let's take a little look at what we got. Get through another little piece of Time and the Gods by Lord Dunsany. Let's see. We have read Night and Morning, and we have not read Usury, though. Very interesting. Okay, this will be where we're. Actually, let me try out this stream marker button here. We're just going to add stream marker. There we go. On Halloween, am I reading viewers' writings or just the Sunday before? Yeah, at this moment, I'm actually not sure, Anya. Excuse me. I had planned on, I mean, because what I have been doing is, yeah, on Halloween evening, doing like a special Halloween show, um, but and which was very successful on Mixer. I mean, last year, yeah, we got front page featured and the whole 9 yards. Yeah, we had like an audience of 800 people tuning in for Halloween stories, which was very nice. Um, but yeah, that's no longer the case, and comparatively, my audience is it's so small right now. I just don't know about doing like a big special event on Halloween. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, yeah, I mean it's yeah. Oh, it was great. It was really good. Um, yeah, it was like a 3 hour show. We had like a 1 hour front page feature. And yeah, so it peaked at about 800, and then I guess for the rest of it we had about 350 people for the non-front page stuff. Um, yeah, so oh, did I? Oh, you want to know your deadline? Yeah, yeah, it is something I've been thinking about. Be 10 days to go. Um, it would be the Sunday after. Well, because Halloween is on a Saturday night. It's on a Saturday night. So and if I do it, it would be over on Twitch. Boy, I'm gonna have to make some. I mean, it's coming up in what, 11 days. Um, I'm gonna have to make some decisions. About whether I'm going to do like the special show on Saturday, because the viewership base which I have right now is it's nowhere near what I had on Mixer. So, um, boy, right now I'm leaning towards just having Short Story Sunday on the Sunday after Halloween to be the thing. Oh, it could be. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, if boy, I don't know. If I was confident enough that I could get like a pull in a decent amount of viewership for the Saturday, I would definitely do it. But I'm still thinking about it right now. Mm. Right. So I'm leaning towards doing it on the Sunday. Yeah, November 1st. Yeah. Back to the drawing board. Back to the drawing board. Okay, let's quickly read up a little thing. Here we go. Okay, so yeah, we'll continue with House of the Seven Gables tomorrow, but we've gone as far as we can today. Well, I mean, if doing another chapter would be running way over time, so we'll finish up with a couple of short stories here. Gradually working our way through Time and the Gods by Lord Dunsany. Let's do it. Usury. The men of Zonu hold that Yan is God, who sits as a usurer behind a heap of little lustrous gems, and ever clutches at them with both his arms. Scarce larger than a drop of water are the gleaming jewels that lie under the grasping talons of Yan, and every jewel is a life. Men tell in Zonu that the earth was empty when Yan devised his plan, and on it no life stirred. Then Yan lured to him shadows whose home was beyond the rim, who knew little of joys and naught of any sorrow, whose place was beyond the rim before the birth of time. These Yan lured to him, and showed them his heap of gems. And in the jewels there was light, and green fields glistened in them, and there were glimpses of blue sky, and little streams, and very faintly little gardens showed that flowered in orchard lands. And some showed winds in the heaven, and some showed the arch of the sky with a waste plain drawn across it, with grasses bent in the wind, and never aught but the plain. But the gems that changed the most had in their centre the ever-changing sea. Then the shadows gazed into their lives, and saw the green fields, and the sea and earth, and the gardens of life. And Jan said, I will loan you each a life, and you may do your work with it upon the scheme of things, and have each a shadow for his servant in green fields and in gardens. Only for these things you shall polish these lives with experience, and cut their edges with your griefs, and in the end shall return them again to me. It's up there, R.C. Cola. A little dabbing action. Nice. And there, too, the shadows consented, that they might have gleaming lives, and have shadows for their servants, and this thing became the law. But the shadows, each with his life, departed, and came to Zonu, and to other lands, and there, with experience, they polished the lives of Jan, and cut them with human griefs, until they gleamed anew. And ever they found new scenes to gleam within these lives, and cities and sails, and men shone in them, where there had been before only green fields and sea. And ever Jan the usurer cried out to remind them of their bargain. When men added to their lives scenes that were pleasant to Jan, then was Jan silent. But when they added scenes that pleased not the eyes of Jan, then did he take a toll of sorrow from them, because it was the law. But men forgot the usurer, and there arose some claiming to be wise in the law, who said that after their labor, which they wrought upon their lives, was done, those lives should be theirs to possess. So men took comfort from their toil and labor, and the grinding and cutting of their griefs. But as their lives began to shine with experience of many things, the thumb and forefinger of Jan would suddenly close upon a life, and the man became a shadow. But away beyond the rim the shadows would say, We have greatly labored for Jan, and have gathered griefs in the world, and caused his lives to shine, and Jan does naught for us. Far better had we stayed where no cares are, floating beyond the rim. And there the shadows fear, lest ever again they be lured by specious promises to suffer usury at the hands of Jan, who is over-skilled in law. Only Jan sits and smiles, watching his hoard increase in preciousness, and hath no pity for the poor shadows whom he hath lured from their quiet to toil in the form of men. And ever Jan lures more shadows, and sends them to brighten his lives, sending the old lives out again to make them brighter still. And sometimes he gives to a shadow a life that was once a king's, and sendeth him with it down to the earth to play the part of a beggar. Or sometimes he sendeth a beggar's life to play the part of a king. What careth Jan? The men of Zonu have been promised by those that claim to be wise in the law, that their lives, which they have toiled at, shall be theirs to possess forever. Yet the men of Zonu fear that Jan is greater and over-skilled in the law,
Moreover, it hath been said that time will bring the hour when the wealth of Jan shall be such as his dreams have lusted for. Then shall Jan leave the earth at rest, and trouble the shadows no more, but sit and gloat with his unseemly face over his hoard of lives, for his soul is a usurer's soul. But others say, and they swear that this is true, that there are gods of old who be far greater than Jan, who made the law wherein Jan is overskilled, and who will one day drive a bargain with him that shall be too hard for Jan. Then Jan shall wander away, a mean, forgotten god, and perchance in some forsaken land shall haggle with the rain for a drop of water to drink, for his soul is a usurer's soul. And the lives who knoweth the gods of old, and the lives who knoweth the gods of old, or what their will shall be. That was kind of fun. Man, so boy, as soon as I finish, I need to record a bunch more from 50 Tales. Oh boy, I got a lot of stuff I need to catch up with. All right, we're gonna do one more, uno más. And I've read it before. It's just a fun, goofy one. I know that you all know this one. Well, I'm fairly sure. Let me make a little stream marker. Throw down another stream marker. Very nice. This is it. So how's RC Cola doing? I'm assuming that's Inca Cola with some fancy different name here on YouTube. Oh, man. Let's see. I need to come up with a better way to promote this stream here, by the way, on YouTube. Something which I normally when I get something going on Twitch, there'll be like a corresponding notification, go up on Twitter or something like that. I've not been doing that over here. I could. I just need to get logged in on my Twitter account over here on the browser here on this PC. Little things all at once. Little things. Oh, I am correct, says RC Cola. Okay. Very nice. Okay. Just in time for one more story. Who knows this one, by the way? It's by H.P. Lovecraft. The Terrible Old Man. It's one of his spooky supernatural ones, but at the same time, it's got a really sly ending. I don't know. I like it. Let's have a little sip of water. Man. Okay. Oh wow! Don't know it. It's really good. It's one of my favorites. I mean, it's not like way out there. I mean, it's almost like yeah. You'll see. And I know I just have a lot of fun with it. The Terrible Old Man. It was the design of Angelo Ricci and Joe Zanek and Manuel Silva to call on the terrible old man. This old man dwells all alone in a very ancient house on Waters Street, near the sea, and is reputed to be both exceedingly rich and exceedingly feeble, which forms a situation very attractive to men of the profession of Messrs. Ricci, Zanek, and Silva,
for that profession was nothing less dignified than robbery. The inhabitant of Kingsport say and think many things about the terrible old man, which generally keep him safe from the attention of gentlemen like Mr. Ricci and his colleagues, despite the almost certain fact that he hides a fortune of indefinite magnitude somewhere about his musty and venerable abode. He is, in truth, a very strange person, believed to have been a captain of East India clipper ships in his day, so old that no one can remember when he was young, and so taciturn that few know his real name. Among the gnarled trees in the front yard of his aged and neglected place, he maintains a strange collection of large stones, oddly grouped and painted so that they resemble the idols in some obscure Eastern temple. This collection frightens away most of the small boys who love to taunt the terrible old man about his long white hair and beard, or to break the small-paned windows of his dwelling with wicked missiles. But there are other things which frighten the older and more curious folk who sometimes steal up to the house to peer in through the dusty panes. These folk say that on a table in a bare room on the ground floor are many peculiar bottles, in each a small piece of lead suspended pendulum-wise from a string. And they say that the terrible old man talks to these bottles, addressing them by such names as Jack, Scarface, Long Tom, Spanish Joe, Peters, and Mate Ellis, and that whenever he speaks to a bottle, the little lead pendulum within makes certain definite vibrations, as if in answer. Those who have watched the tall, lean, terrible old man in these peculiar conversations do not watch him again. But Angelo Ricci and Joe Zanek and Manuel Silva were not of Kingsport blood. They were of that new and heterogeneous alien stock which lies outside the charmed circle of New England life and traditions, and they saw in the terrible old man merely a tottering, almost helpless greybeard, who could not walk without the aid of his knotted cane, and whose thin, weak hands shook pitifully. They were really quite sorry, in their way, for the lonely, unpopular old fellow, whom everybody shunned, and at whom all the dogs barked singularly. But business is business, and to a robber whose soul is in his profession, there is a lure and a challenge about a very old and very feeble man who has no account at the bank, and who pays for his few necessities at the village store with Spanish gold and silver minted 2 centuries ago. Messrs. Ricci, Zanek, and Silva selected the night of April 11th for their call. Mr. Ricci and Mr. Silva were to interview the poor old gentleman, whilst Mr. Zanek waited for them and their presumable metallic burden with a covered motor car in Ship Street, by the gate in the tall rear wall of their host's grounds. Desire to avoid needless explanations in case of unexpected police intrusions prompted these plans for a quiet and unostentatious departure. Why's that, Anya? Anya's saying time to rethink their careers as thieves. Sounds like an easy enough job, this one. As prearranged, the three adventurers started out separately in order to prevent any evil-minded suspicions afterward. Misters Ricci and Silver met in Water Street by the old man's front gate, and although they did not like the way the moon shone down upon the painted stones through the budding branches of the gnarled trees, they had more important things to think about than mere idle superstition. They feared it might be unpleasant work, making the terrible old man loquacious concerning his hoarded gold and silver. For aged sea captains are notably stubborn and perverse. Still, he was very old and very feeble, and there were two visitors. Misters Ricci and Silver were experienced in the art of making unwilling persons voluble, and the screams of a weak and exceptionally venerable man can be easily muffled. So they moved up to the one lighted window, and heard the terrible old man talking childishly to his bottles with pendulums. Then they donned masks and knocked politely at the weather-stained oaken door. Waiting seemed very long to Mr. Zanek as he fidgeted restlessly in the covered motor car by the terrible old man's back gate in Ship Street. He was more than ordinarily tender-hearted, and he did not like the hideous screams he had heard in the ancient house just after the hour appointed for the deed. Had he not told his colleagues to be as gentle as possible with the pathetic old sea captain? Very nervously he watched that narrow oaken gate in the high and ivy-clad stone wall. Frequently he consulted his watch and wondered at the delay. Had the old man died before revealing where his treasure was hidden, and had a thorough search become necessary? Mr. Zanek did not like to wait so long in the dark in such a place. Then he sensed a soft tread or tapping on the walk inside the gate, heard a gentle fumbling at the rusty latch, and saw the narrow, heavy door swing inward. And in the pallid glow of the single dim street lamp he strained his eyes to see what his colleagues had brought out of that sinister house which loomed so close behind. But when he looked, he did not see what he had expected, for his colleagues were not there at all, but only the terrible old man leaning quietly on his knotted cane and smiling hideously. Mr. Zanek had never before noticed the color of that man's eyes. Now he saw that they were yellow. Little things make considerable excitement in little towns, which is the reason that Kingsport people talked all that spring and summer about the 3 unidentifiable bodies, horribly slashed as with many cutlasses, and horribly mangled as by the tread of many cruel boot heels, which the tide washed in. And some people even spoke of things as trivial as the deserted motor car found in Ship Street, or certain especially inhuman cries, probably of a stray animal or migratory bird, heard in the night by wakeful citizens. But in this idle village gossip the terrible old man took no interest at all. He was by nature reserved, and when one is aged and feeble, one's reserve is doubly strong. Besides, so ancient a sea captain must have witnessed scores of things much more stirring in the far-off days of his unremembered youth. I don't know. It's just so funny the way it ends. I mean, there's a lot of like reading between the lines in that one there. I don't know. I think it's funny. All right. But that is it. That is it for the Carrington. That is it. BW, like that one? You're very welcome, Melissa. I'm so grateful to have people tuning in. I really am.